Hey, and welcome to a new challenge run. Today we're going to be answering the question, can you beat Control without the service weapon? This video is going to be pretty different from my previous challenge runs because Control is a very narrative-focused game, and also there honestly just isn't a whole lot to say about the combat and gameplay in general. So, to ensure that this video isn't just 5 minutes of me saying I flung a rock at an enemy, I'll also be summarizing the game's events as they take place. I also just really like this game and want to talk about it, so here we go. If you haven't played Control before, first of all, you should, it's fantastic, especially if you like supernatural conspiracy stuff like X-Files, Delta Green, or SCP. I mean, it's basically SCP the game, but actually really good. The story revolves around Jessie Faden and her attempts to find her brother Dylan, who was taken away by the Bureau of Control when they were children. The mysterious, shadowy government agency showed up after a mysterious event that happened in Jessie and Dylan's hometown of Ordinary, which caused all the adults to vanish, never to be seen again. With the help of Polaris, a weird extra-dimensional resonance-based entity that lives inside Jessie's head, Jessie finally tracks down the Bureau of Control's headquarters in New York City, which is where the game begins. So, before we get into the meat of the game, let's talk a little bit about this challenge. The service weapon is a magical pistol that you get at the very beginning of the game. As you progress, you're able to craft and upgrade forms for the pistol. These forms change the functionality of the service weapon, allowing it to shoot like a shotgun, or sniper rifle, or minigun, and a large portion of the progression revolves around finding materials to craft forms and mods for the gun. So, what happens when we don't use the service weapon? Well, we're not out of combat options. When you get the service weapon, you also get a melee attack option that, well, it certainly does an amount of damage. It's kinda ass, but it's what we're stuck with for the first part of the run. Luckily, a little later, Jessie also gets access to a bunch of cool superpowers that can be used in combat. So this is going to be one of those challenges that starts off super hard, but gets significantly easier the farther into it we get. With all that out of the way, let's finally start the run. Entering the bureau, we find it eerily empty except for a lone night janitor, Ati, a slightly off-putting dude who sends us to the director's office to interview for a position as the janitor's assistant. As we approach the office, Jessie is startled by the sound of a gunshot. We enter the director's office to see the late director Zachariah Trench dead on the floor, having been shot in the head, seemingly self-inflicted. Jessie brilliantly picks up the gun because, as every orphan on the run from the government would know, the first thing you should do if you find a murder weapon in a government building is to get your fingerprints all over it. After a brief cutscene explaining the importance of the service weapon, we're transported to the astral plane for the first time, where we listen to the board and find the run killer. The astral plane basically serves as little tutorial areas for whenever you get a new ability. Can you guess what ability the area's gonna try to teach me? If you guessed how to shoot a gun, you'd be right. To progress the game, we have to beat this tutorial. To beat the tutorial, we have to get to the final platform. To get to the final platform, we have to kill these two enemies, and to kill these two enemies, we have to use the service weapon. There's no way to get to them to do a melee attack, and no other options for ranged attacks. You have to shoot them. Hell, even the world record speedrun of this game had to shoot them. So, no, you can't beat Control without the service weapon. But, as you can see from the fact that this video isn't 2 minutes long, I decided that I'd play the rest of the game anyway. For one, it's my channel, I make the rules, and I say that mandatory tutorial sections don't count. For two, the main reason I'm making this video in the first place is just because I wanted an excuse to play this game again. So I bit the bullet, and then made those two jackasses do the same. After completing the board's little test, Jessie is now officially the director of the Bureau of Control. Letting a gun choose in charge of the not SCP Foundation sounds like a terrible idea, but what do I know? I'm not a mysterious void pyramid. So we exit the office and are immediately attacked by the Hiss, a hostile entity with some disconcerting similarities to Polaris. It produces a sound that infects humans, turning them into weird, glowing, extra-dimensional pseudo-zombies. Luckily, Jessie already has one space white noise maker in her head, and doesn't have room for two, so I begin the first real combat encounter of the run. I never realized just how shit the melee attack is until it was my only option. Its main purpose in the early game is to blast away the energy shields that some enemies have, and it has a decent knockback. But it's absolutely shit damage combined with the fact that you have to have Jessie physically facing the direction you want her to melee attack in makes it a fucking nightmare to use. My tactic for the beginning of the game is basically just to run around and do drive-by force push attacks to avoid it being shot in the face. There aren't any healing items in Control. The only way to get health back once you've lost it is to either collect the little blue things that enemies drop when they get injured, or to rest at a control point. Control points are basically the bonfires of this game. For now, running around and grabbing health pickups from dead enemies isn't a huge deal, since there's only a couple of them and they don't hit super hard. But I do almost die in the first encounter. And then we get to the second encounter. The first time I die is because I was still at low health from the previous fight. The rest of the times I die is because Ranger 2nd Class Polanski is the hardest boss of the entire run. By a lot. This fight took me a solid 20 minutes of trial and error before I finally got the timing down. Taking out the other enemies in the room is simple enough. My hit and run strategy from the first fight worked fine. But Polanski. Fucking Polanski. Dude hits like a truck this early on and takes off most of my health with a single volley from his weapon. He also has a melee attack that is absolutely brutal. What finally ended up working was to run up in his face, hit him with a melee attack, stay in his face to trigger a melee attack from him, then sprint away for 2 to 3 steps before turning Jessie around to hit him with another melee attack, and then repeat that process until he eventually died. With Polanski the Destroyer dealt with, we cleanse our first control point and meet Emily Pope. A scientist who's an assistant to Dr. Darling, head of research for the Bureau. After learning that Jessie has the ability to cleanse control points of his influence, Emily asks us to try to cleanse one of the floating Bureau staff that have been also infected by the hiss. It goes poorly. Completely unfazed by the new director just Thanos snapping her coworker out of existence, Emily sends us to go find the hotline. A weird extra-dimensional phone that allows us to speak with both the board and ex-director Trench. Basically everything in this game is weird and extra-dimensional, just like SCP. The hotline is on the far side of the communications department. On my way over, I fight some more standard hiss guards. It's tough, but certainly doable. Although I do almost die when I accidentally blow up an explodey thing right in front of my face at the end of the fight. Something that will become a bit of a recurring theme of this run. Combat right now is mostly just about staying in motion and picking off enemies one by one. Running through communications, I see a dude get fucking decked with a tube, which leads me to the first and most important ability, launch. After mind melding with the weird extra-dimensional Cold War nuclear launch code holding floppy disk, we can now fling furniture and rip chunks out of walls and floor. Suddenly the game is a cakewalk. Okay, that's not true. There are definitely some tricky parts, and it definitely is a different playstyle than when you have the gun, but this ability will carry us through the entirety of the rest of the game. With the launch ability, my playstyle shifts to be a bit more passive. Until I get some ability points to upgrade Jessie, I can only use the launch twice in a row before the power bar has to recharge. So from here on out, I'll be doing a lot more hanging back and waiting for enemies to come to me, or picking them off at a distance while staying behind cover. Because in order to level up my abilities to keep my damage output high, I'll be mostly neglecting to upgrade Jessie's health bar. After picking up a level 1 security clearance card from a corpse, we're finally able to get into the mailroom, where we have to deal with a brand new type of enemy, Hiss Elevated. Tomasi here is the first one, and a boss, so he'll be harder to take down than normal Elevated. Most new enemy types are introduced in boss fights like this. These fuckers fly around and use their own version of the launch ability to do pretty devastating damage. They also have a dodge ability that they'll use to avoid items launched at them, but you can circumvent this by just chucking 2 items at them, one immediately after the other. The fight's pretty straightforward. I just launch 2 items, take cover till the power bar refills, then repeat. There are a handful of other enemies that'll spawn around the arena, but most of them go down with just 1 hit from the launch. Tomasi flies away in a cutscene before we're able to finish off, which leaves us free to continue towards the hotline. To get to the phone, we have to pass through the Ocean View Motel, a weird, dreamlike place that operates on the rule of 3. We'll be coming back here quite a bit, and the little puzzles in here do get more complex over time, but for now, all we do is pull the cord 3 times, ring the bell 3 times, then pick up the black triangle key and boogie on over to the hotline. There's a very quick and easy Astral Planes challenge, and then we've got our cute little red retro telephone. Trench lets us know that his management team, Darling, Tomasi, Salvador, and Marshall, know a whole bunch of weird shit about the Bureau and can probably help. Well, Tomasi is clearly not going to be of much use, and we don't know where to begin looking for the rest of them, so for now we just head back to Emily to report our progress. We already know that Darling is a big fancy science man. Emily tells us a bit more about Salvador, head of security, and Marshall, head of operations. She's confident that Marshall can help us, but is currently stuck in the research sector. To get to her, we'll have to shut down the internal lockdown by performing a directorial override in the maintenance sector. Our boy Ati sends an elevator that lets us get down to maintenance in spite of the lockdown, on the condition that we go talk to him. So we make our way through the maintenance access corridors, fighting a handful of hiss on the way. They're a bit tougher down here, but launch is still more than pulling its weight. And I'm able to take them down with either 1 launch or a launch followed up by a melee attack. I died after getting overconfident and rushing in to attack a whole horde of enemies at once. Not smart. But as long as I don't do stupid shit like that, the combat's fairly easy. Takes a while, and gets a little tedious for larger groups of enemies, but not terribly difficult. I'd like to reiterate that the main reason for doing this challenge run is that I just really like this game and wanted an excuse to play it again. Right before the janitor's office, I got distracted by glowing lights and abruptly sucked into the astral plane to go deal with a spooky merry-go-round horse. Cleansing the horse grants Jesse the ability to dodge. I tend to use this more for mobility than in combat, but it'll come in handy a bit later when we start to come across enemies that chuck grenades. We then meet up with Ati, who says some weird cryptic shit and then tells me that I have to go run some errands for him as his assistant, or else the power plant under the building will explode. We have to go deal with a vermin problem in the cooling pumps and something with the power generators. Vermin and the cooling pumps are up first because there's a side quest we can do for some easy ability points over there too. On the way, we run into the NCES security station and meet some friendly NPCs. Most are nameless, one is not. Arish is a pretty chipper dude for someone potentially in an XK class end of the world scenario. He gives us some more background information on the Bureau in general and the power plant in particular. Basically, nobody knows how it works or what NCS stands for because it's super duper classified. He also mentions that Dr. Darling was seen down here a few days ago in his underwear, which isn't a great sign. Then we're off to cooling pumps. Around here is where I start running into some hiss charge. They're very fragile and die if you so much as sneeze in their general directions, but they have the power of extra-dimensional kamikaze. They just throw themselves at you and blow up. Also, their corpses explode a few seconds after death. They are currently very annoying. Now for that side quest I mentioned. Ati said that there was some trash that needed picking up over by the incinerator, so naturally we chuck some glowing green biohazard barrels directly into the furnace. Like I said, easy ability points. Moving on. The coolant pumps are pretty easy to deal with. Just gotta shove batteries into the battery-shaped slots on the pump and then deal with a wave of enemies after each battery. The last pump is where the whole vermin thing comes in. The pipe is blocked by something and keeps spitting out the battery, so we have to go unblock it. The vermin Ati mentioned is this horrible Lovecraftian mass of vile spewing fleshy nodules. and since I have to wait for my power bar to recharge after every other shot, I have to stand there looking at the grody thing for way longer than I'd like. After throwing like 30 rocks at the damn thing, it finally decides that coolant pumps aren't tasty enough to be worth the trouble, and I can put the final battery in. Now it's time to head on down to the power converters to make the building not explode. Except this guy just about gave me a heart attack when he popped out from the elevator and blasted me with a minigun. He's not actually hard to deal with, just kept my distance and chucked rocks at him between bullet rain volleys, and his super mutant looking ass went down no problem. The NCS energy converters are essentially the same as the coolant pumps. Just clear out the area, then toss the batteries into the battery slots. It is slightly complicated by the new enemies with rocket launchers, but they're not tanky, and the dodge is useful for running away when you see a flaming rocket flying directly towards your face. These guys will actually be a great resource later on once I unlock the upgrade for the launch ability that lets you return to sender the various explosives. And finally, the building is no longer going to explode, so we can do what we came here to do: lift the emergency lockdown. A short walk later, and we're finally able to cleanse the control point in the area and lift the internal lockdown with the power of gun. The bureau will still be locked down to any exterior exit or entry while the hiss are in the building, but that'll be dealt with in time. Now the main objective is to go talk to Emily again, and we could do that, or we could go do a side quest that gets Jesse a neat new ability. Running over to Central Maintenance, we find field training. Now, normally this side quest is laughably easy, with the obstacle course taking all of about 20 seconds to complete. This is not a normal playthrough. I am not allowed to shoot the targets. They can still be triggered with launch or a melee attack, but man, I had some serious trouble actually landing the hits on these stupid little things. On the third attempt, I finally made it through, but only barely.
Course failed. Course complete. Try again when congratulations.
Fuck you, awkward voice recording.
Then Jesse cleanses a floating safe and gains the shield ability. Very useful. Returning to Emily, Jesse decides to tell her about Dylan and the weird extra-dimensional slide projector that they used as kids to find Polaris, and a bunch of other horrific shit that ended up yeeting all the adults into the void. Emily tells us that finding Marshall is the best way to find out what happened to Dylan, and that to get to her, we'll need to go through the research sector. Right as we get into the research sector, there's a whole lot of enemies to deal with, including a boss. One of the few things that I really don't like about this game is that almost every single boss is just a regular enemy with like 5 times their normal amount of health. They're not really worth talking about because you just do the same thing you would against normal enemies, just for longer. To get to Marshall, you have to get past a room with a loose astral spike. These weird pulsating orbs of black rock are unkillable and do damage if they get close. In most cases, it's just a matter of running around or over them, but in this room you have to lure it into its little cage in the back and then zip around, put a couple batteries in slots, and close the door. Further in, and we meet our first hiss cluster. These things aren't a threat on their own, but they do heal other hiss in the area, so they have to be taken out first. After taking out the cluster, Jessie decided that she wanted to have a chunk of her torso missing for a bit and then be invisible for a while. Not sure what that was about, but restarting the game seemed to fix it. I unfortunately lost about an hour and a half of footage, and when I say lost, I mean actually lost. I know I recorded it, but when I went to start editing the video, the recording was nowhere to be found. The main thing relevant to the gameplay of this challenge is that I did a side quest to get the Seize ability that lets you convert low health enemies to your side, which is mostly useful for buying myself a little bit of time to grab health pickups when there are a lot of enemies. As for plot things that happened, well, I met up with Marshall, found Darling's lab, started up the HRA machine, broke the HRA machine, did a stupid puzzle to fix the HRA machine, then headed towards Blackrock Processing to find some more Black Rocks to make more HRAs. HRAs stand for Hadron Resonance Amplifiers. They're the speaker-looking things that everyone but Jesse wears. They keep people safe from the hiss by amplifying hadron resonance, a mysterious frequency that Darling discovered. Fast forwarding to the point that I've actually got footage for, we find our first hiss distorted. These guys suck. They can turn invisible and have this nasty habit of sneaking up behind Jesse and detonating a brutal concussive blast. Luckily, when I say they're invisible, I don't mean invisible, I mean video game invisible. They're a lot harder to see for sure, especially in dark areas, but they are surrounded by a distortion effect so you can see them coming and hit them with launch attacks. The shield also comes in clutch if you ever lose sight of them. With the distorted taken care of, Polaris leads Jesse to a box of broken black rock prisms. Conveniently, we're able to follow signs to a black rock quarry to go find some more. Welcome to my favorite area of the game, aesthetically speaking, of course. This place is cosmic and just totally rad. Fighting through the area to get to the main quarry is pretty straightforward. Enemies have been getting stronger and tankier, but I've also been able to spend ability points to make launch do more damage, and have more power to launch more times in a row. So I'm still able to take out most enemies with a single launch. After taking a bit to admire the scenery, I take out a couple more waves of enemies, then blast open one of the rock walls to get a brand spanking new black rock prism. As soon as I grab the prism, a handful of astral spikes spawn. They're easy enough to get around, I say as I run directly into one, but if they do get you, a couple dodges are enough to get you well out of their range. So now it's back to Central Executive to talk with Marshall and finally get some answers about Dylan. Marshall tells us that Dylan is here in the Bureau because he was being primed to take over as director. But Marshall claims that Dylan is violent and unstable. Jesse's less than convinced and goes to find him in the Panopticon, the high-security holding areas for objects of power. Also, Marshall fucks off somewhere mysterious, never to be seen again in the base game, after giving an ominous warning to not let Dylan out. In the containment sector, I got almost immediately sidetracked by one of the more tragic side quests that is undercut just a bit by the comical number of clocks. Basically, you find a dude who escaped a hiss attack and are sent back to where he was attacked to find a medic friend of his who stayed behind. You find the medic, traverse through the clocks to get back to the first guy, only to find him taken over by the hiss, and are forced to kill him. I'd be going into more detail if you got anything other than ability points for this quest. I did almost die immediately in the Horowitz boss fight because I got cocky and stayed up in his face where I got shot at least 12 times. Back to the main quest. By this point, I've unlocked the ability to grab and launch low-health enemies, which means that even if a single launch isn't enough to kill them outright, it typically is enough to get them within launching range. We also start running into our first mold enemies. Right, mold. Basically, there's some sort of extra-dimensional fungus that got in somehow in the basement, and is slowly taking over the building. There's a whole optional area where you learn about it and do some side quests and fight a giant mold monster, but it's not really related to the main story at all, so we'll save that for some other time. The main thing that's important for this video is that they're tough as hell and the fuckers with the ranged attack hit like a damn truck. Further into the sector, we find a security booth with a screen showing a containment breach in P6's cell. That's Dylan's cell. That's probably not a good thing. We talk with the Panopticon supervisor, who tells us that before we do anything else, we have to go calm down a TV that's in there breaking things, as you do. Climbing up the Panopticon, we chat briefly with a dude who's stuck staring down a less intimidating SCP-173. We tell him that there's an emergency, but we'll definitely be back later for him. We will not be coming back for this man. The Banikoff TV is definitely one of the cooler objects of power that gives us one of the cooler abilities. We have to make our way through this neat little Inception-style area, and when we get to the TV, we have to face off against Salvador, a member of Trench's management team and head of security for the Bureau. The fight really only takes as long as it does because he regenerates his shield so damn often. With a little patience and timing, it's pretty simple to keep him off balance and stop him from throwing shit at you while you whittle down his health bar. After the fight, we cleanse the TV and gain the ability to fly. Although I suppose she's just hovering. It's not that impressive. Nah, it is impressive and super fun, and surprisingly useful in combat. Enemies behind cover, just fly up and get a better angle on them. With our new ability, we're able to float up to the 5th level where the P6 cell is. Inside, we find the cell absolutely destroyed, and over the intercom, Emily tells us that Dylan is in Central Executive with her, having turned himself in. Back at home base, we talk to Emily and learn that Dylan is infected by the hiss, but different from the others, seemingly more in control. We're able to finally come face to face with Dylan, the whole reason Jesse came here in the first place. He seems troubled, claiming Polaris is the true evil and that the hiss is good. He tells us to go to the Prime Candidate program in the containment sector to find out the truth about the Bureau. We agree, but only to look for the slide projector. The current theory is that since it's what let the hiss in, maybe it can kick them out, or at least stop this from getting worse. In the Prime Candidate program, we head past the P6 room and into the P7 room. And hey, would you look at that? You know what they say, it's not paranoia if there's someone actually out to get you. Apparently there's a whole section of this area dedicated to the ordinary AWE, the Altered World event that happened to Jesse and Dylan as kids with the slide projector that started off this whole mess. Sounds like a good place to start looking. And get jump scared by a rare elevator hiss. Also had a hiss distorted that exploded in my face so hard that it crashed the game. The ordinary AWE research lab is bizarre. They made this adorable little cardboard reconstruction of the city in which we get ambushed by hiss, of course. Even more bizarre is that instead of recreating the garbage dump in which the slide projector was found, they just scooped up a bunch of trash from Ordinary and put it in a concrete room, which is very funny to me for reasons that I can't quite put into words. Heading into Darling's mobile lab, in the mock dump, we find that unfortunately the slide projector has been moved into dimensional research. To get there, we have to pass through the ashtray maze. The maze is currently broken. How you break an extra dimensional maze is beyond me. But to get through, we have to track down Ati. All the way back in the janitor's office, Jesse receives a vision from Ati after touching a painting. Don't think I've emphasized how weird of a character Ati is. It's heavily implied that he's not human and instead is some sort of manifestation of the building the Bureau is housed in. We just follow the visions of Sunset to find Ati way down in the basement of the building. The enemies on the way down are actually kind of tough to fight. I die for the first time in a long while, dealing with some of the mold enemies. I've already fully upgraded the launch damage, which is a bit concerning. There are still mods I can equip to further augment my damage. But actually having some tension in the combat is a nice change of pace. I had to deal with another horrible goo monster, this time in the Ocean View Motel. We scare it away with Ati's singing and leave the motel. This time through the janitor's closet. We actually get spat out at the Black Rock Quarry again, and as much as I would love to hang out here and look at the pretty sky, we've got a janitor to find. So I just glide through the area, ignoring the enemies way down below. Dropping down an elevator shaft puts us in the restricted area, where I have to deal with probably the most tense combat encounter in the game. There's a shitload of enemies and they do a shitload of damage. I ran up to hit the button that sends the gondola thing over and just try to survive. Eventually, I'm able to hop on and take cover as the gondola slowly takes me away across the bottomless chasm of fog. Running towards the white light, we get to see some really neat visual effects before getting Ati's player. Ati's tape player that will let us get through the ashtray maze. And now the ashtray maze. Man, there's literally nothing I could possibly say here to do this part of the game justice, so I'm just gonna shut up and play you some footage. By far the coolest part of the game, not even a contest.
That was awesome.
Dimensional research, the beating, bleeding heart of all this chaos. Turns out the slide projector isn't here either, but something else is. Hedron. Polaris? It's intentionally vague, but I think that Polaris is a part of Hedron that got stuck with Jesse and Dylan when they used the slide projector as kids. Hedron's resonance is what's been protecting the survivors from the hiss, and we just opened up the floodgates. We try to save Hedron, defeating wave after wave of his enemies and cleansing satellite dishes, but it's not enough. Hedron dies, and Polaris goes silent for the first time since Ordinary. Without the protection of Polaris, Jesse is quickly overcome by the hiss. After one of the better end credit fake-outs I've seen, Jesse finds herself trapped, doing menial labor for the Bureau until she's able to break the loop by taking the service weapon and reclaiming her role as director. Once more into the ocean view, but this time there's no stupid puzzles or games. Jesse is in control and she finds a piece of Polaris surviving in her mind. And now it's time to end this. Dylan and the hiss have invaded the astral plane and begun their assault on the board, and we have to stop them. I really wish this final sequence was more interesting. After the epic high of the ashtray maze, this is just really anticlimactic in my opinion. It's just fighting off waves of enemies to progress from one platform to the next. Sure, the enemies are level 30, but the game gives Jesse a massive power boost too, so it doesn't really mean anything. After several minutes of that, we finally purge the hiss from Dylan, sending him into a coma and ending the worst of the hiss invasion. There are still hiss in the building, which allows for DLC and a post-game section, but as far as the main plot of Control goes, we're done. So, can you beat Control without the service weapon? Technically, no, but if you don't count that one bit of the tutorial, you totally can, and it's a pretty fun challenge. But that's gonna do it for today. I'll see y'all next time for a brand new challenge run. Bye.